Hello, welcome to Conversation with a Geographer. I'm Mike DeVivo, Professor of Geography here at Grand Rapids Community College, and today we have Amanda Colegrove, who is with the Coalition Against Trafficking and Exploitation in St. Louis, Missouri. Amanda delivered a talk last night as a member of a panel devoted to this discussion on human trafficking that was sponsored by the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan. It's really interesting, Amanda. Here you are back in Grand Rapids, and you're giving a presentation at Aquinas College where you went to school, and it's sponsored by the World Affairs Council that has sponsored notable people like Desmond Tutu, spoken here, many of the NPR correspondents, Dina Temple-Graston, Mary Louise Kelly, Deb Amos have spoken. And so there you are, you know, one of Grand Rapids' children, really, that was in town discussing your work. How did it feel?
It was a great honor. It was a real pleasure to be able to talk about this subject. I'm very passionate about this work that I do, so anytime I get to talk about it, wherever it is, I'm thrilled. But also to come back to the campus of Aquinas and GRCC, because I attended both of these schools and they're great institutions, and so that was really nice to be able to come back and show where I have come from and where I've headed. So. Well,
speaking of where you came from, I mean, you're a geographer, you're working as a coalition organizer, you're really involved in social justice. You're putting your money where your mouth is in a lot of ways.
I'm sure trying, yeah.
Okay. Can you tell us about your background, maybe from childhood in some ways? What influenced you really to not necessarily pursue this element of social justice per se, but your interest in humanitarian causes, let's say?
Sure. Well, I guess my childhood really isn't that spectacular. I grew up. I didn't do anything fun or special. I didn't play sports or anything like that. But I did grow up in a very religious family, and you know, that idea that God is for justice, and that idea has always been deeply implanted in me. As I grew up and I got a job and attended to daily life, I knew that I wanted to do something, but college is expensive, and I didn't want to pay for something that I didn't know where I wanted to go with it. So I waited until I was into my 30s before I actually went to school for social justice causes. And so when I came to GRCC, I started in the sociology department, and then took a geography class, and that pretty much changed the course of my academic career. It was in that particular class that I came across just a little paragraph about human trafficking in the world and in the U.S., and I was shocked. I couldn't believe that in this day and age we still had that kind of slavery going on.
You had not examined that at all before?
No, it had never crossed my mind. I mean, we had the Emancipation Proclamation, we had the Civil War, we had the Civil Rights era. In my mind, slavery was just this very small thing that happened in other countries in extreme poverty kind of idea. It wasn't something that happened here in the United States. And boy, was I wrong. So that little paragraph sent me on a journey to explore the issue myself, go find whatever research was out there, and learn everything that I could. And at that time, there was very, very little out there. Such small amounts of research were being done, and probably 95% of it was international. There wasn't a lot of knowledge and research being done about trafficking here in the U.S. And so that's where I began to focus my efforts. And when I went to grad school, I continued in the geography field and developed a model for assessing possible risk of human trafficking on a local level, and using these qualitative factors, because the hard data, the quantitative data, was never accurate enough. It wasn't recorded in a consistent fashion, and it was just impossible for nonprofits and other agencies who needed data in order to get the funding they require. They couldn't do it. They were in a hard place. So my idea was to provide them with some kind of research that would allow them to say, hey, this is the kind of risk we have in this area, and so we need this funding in order to raise awareness and fight this evil. So that's kind of where that background stuff came from. And when I came to graduation time for my master's degree, it just so happened that a position with the Coalition Against Trafficking and Exploitation opened up. And I went right from grad school into working against trafficking. So it was very synchronous.
So really, that one paragraph that you read in a geography course at GRCC sparked your interest. You ended up, if I recall correctly, you delivered papers at national conferences on this subject. And as you indicated, most of the work was done in the international arena. I believe you did something on Latin American trafficking in the U.S., I think?
Yeah, Central America, I started focusing on that and the, like what were the Central American countries doing to fight it? What did it really look like? That kind of thing, because each region of the world has a little bit different kind of trafficking. It happens a little bit different. In some locations like Western Europe, it's not as organized crime driven, whereas in Eastern Europe, it's far more organized crime that's running the show. Places like Asia, China, Japan, there's a lot more organized crime involved. But if in Central America, it's like one person being very opportunistic and taking advantage of another person. There's not a lot of organization to it. And if one person stops, there's someone in the ready. And there's no one person through the whole process. So like in Central America, you have someone who might recruit, but they then deliver that person to the transporter who then takes them across state lines. And then that person hands them off to somebody else. Whereas in an organized crime system, it all stays within the organized crime network. So if something happens to one of the recruiters in Central America, that just another one pops up, just like that. So it's harder to track. So I did some of that work in there, and then what were the governments doing to fight it? What was America doing? What was the United States doing to help with that? And some of the aid work that was available to international communities for fighting human trafficking, and slowly began to work backwards into what was happening in the U.S. and what did trafficking look like here in our borders, and learning a little bit more about how where we thought prostitution were these individuals who wanted to do this service, wanted to be out on the streets for a bunch of different reasons, and maybe not their favorite choice, but this is what they chose. And then learning that really the whole process was about coercion, brutality, and a facilitated drug addiction. And so here in the U.S., trafficking became a really eye-opener to the underbelly of the prostitution industry.
You mentioned something about drugs and drug trafficking as well. If I recall looking at some of your work some years ago, you indicated that, in fact, there are many narcotics traffickers that have actually supplemented or even substituted their initial endeavors with human trafficking.
Yeah, and it was a simple switch for them because they already had the path, you know, and it follows the same narcotics path, and they traffic humans through that same geography. So that was really simple. The thing about drugs is you have a product, you sell it, it's gone. You have to invest even more money to get more product and to sell it. With a human, you sell that person over and over and over again until they die. And you don't have to keep investing more and more. You provide them with just enough food to survive, just enough shelter, maybe so they don't freeze to death at night. And that's all you need, and that's it. And so the profit margin is huge. In one research that was in the early 2000s, our most successful corporations, multinational corporations, things like Microsoft and GE, their profit margins are like 17%, 23%. I mean, these are really high profit margins for a corporation. Human trafficking's profit margin is about 70%.
Wow,
yeah.
70%. And I suppose the penalties for one caught trafficking in humans are far less than trafficking in drugs.
Absolutely. The risk is minimal, especially if you are in a country where there's a lot of corruption in the justice system. So then a trafficker really just buys their way out. They don't really pay much of a penalty at all, even if they do get arrested. Most of them never get arrested because the cops they're just not going to do that. But if they do happen to get arrested, then they're out within a few days or weeks because they just pay their way. They pay the judges or the lawyers or whoever. And so the penalties are minimal. It's getting better. One of the things that the U.S. does with their Trafficking Victims Protection Act is they grade all of these countries around the world with their efforts and how well they're doing in prosecutions and sentencing. And they tie non-humanitarian aid to their trafficking efforts. So if they don't provide significant progress along the way, that they are doing better, that they are making convictions, they are trying to prevent, then the U.S. can say, we're not going to give you this particular package of aid. So it's gotten a little better globally, and as human trafficking has become a more salient topic around the world, more people are watching these countries, so they have a little bit more pressure to do the right thing, but it's still slow in coming. Here in the United States, you can get up to 25 years for trafficking an individual. And in some cases, we did just have someone get a life sentence for a particularly brutal trafficking situation. I mean, they were just really...
Was that in Missouri or in the U.S.?
Yeah, it was in Missouri. It was a pretty horrific case. It was mind-boggling, like how another human could do that to somebody else. So they, and it involved a minor, and not just a teenage minor, but they were under the age of 10. And so that, the jury was like, that's it, you're gone. But that's the highest and the first time anyone has gotten a life sentence for trafficking. Most of the sentences stay around 8 or 10 years. Every once in a while, we'll get a 15-year sentence. But
do we see many traffickers engage in this activity, incarcerated for a few years, and then go back to engage in this activity again? Have you looked at that?
We haven't looked at that too closely since they're just now beginning to get these incarceration rates. Not many of them have gotten out yet. Some of them have because they only got like 3 or 4 years, but we haven't really seen if they're going back yet or if maybe they just haven't been caught yet. So we don't really know yet. If we're talking about internationally, then yeah, they almost inevitably go right back to it because they're buying their way out. When they leave, they just walk right back into the life of trafficking humans.
Well, you made a comment just a moment ago that this matter of human trafficking is becoming a more salient topic. Still, very little is done about this at the legislative level. Can you comment on that? Why do you suppose the federal government and state governments do very little?
Well, it's a much more complicated issue than we would like it to be. As are most social issues. We would prefer things to be very cut and dried. Here's the problem, here's the solution. But reality problems are just so far more complicated. We want to make this decision and put this solution in place, and then it has all of these unintended consequences that were far worse than we thought they would be. So that's part of the problem. But the other part of the problem is there's no will. The legislators just don't have the will to do something. That's where voters become really important, to become knowledgeable about this topic, and then start hounding their legislators, both on the state level and at the federal level, to say, hey, this is important to us, and you work for us, so start looking at this. When they do talk about human trafficking in the legislation, it's always bipartisan. This is not a partisan issue. Nobody wants to be known as the senator or the congressperson who voted no on human trafficking legislation. So it's not like they are worried about their job because nobody votes against these bills. So then we come to probably the deepest problem, the most ingrained problem that maybe is rooted right down to the very core of our democracy even. Is the government benefits from trafficking. So when people are trafficked into the United States and they are working essentially for free, that depresses the wages of all of us in that same industry. So when wages are depressed, that means corporations are making more money. They have a higher profit margin. When corporations have a higher profit margin, they give more money into the government to buy the legislation that they want, to buy their way out of regulations and that sort of thing. And so if the legislators become very serious about tackling these trafficking issues, it's going to cost businesses, because businesses are dependent on this unseen free labor that we don't want to talk about here in the United States, because we're all implicated. Every person in this room who's taping this, me here sitting here talking, you listening, everybody who hears the sound of our voice and watches this online, we are all implicated in labor trafficking. If you own something that is made out of cotton, that was picked by slave labor 90% of the time. If you eat chocolate, 99% of the chocolate that we eat comes from slave labor, child slave labor.
Talking about abroad or in this country?
Abroad.
Okay.
We're going to talk about in this country. We still have sweatshops in this country. They're just harder to find. They do a little better job at hiding them. In many cases, what happens is, we've talked about debt bondage, where it might start out as a smuggling case, where a victim says, yes, please get me across the border and I'll give you this much money. And when they get to the United States, the smuggler says, oh, well, you owe me twice that, and you owe me for this and this, I gave you water and food, and I gave you a Band-Aid or whatever, and they jack the prices up. And so that's very common. And so then they never get out of debt. They're working for free and enduring very inhumane conditions. But another side to that, which is even easier for traffickers, is they'll bring you in and they might pay you the first couple of weeks. And then they're like, oh, I don't have the money right now, but I'll pay you next week. So then they go without, and so then they start this process where they take longer and longer and longer to pay the wage. And so eventually the employee, well, he thinks he's an employee, feels like he can't leave or he'll never get his money.
Gotcha.
She thinks, if I leave this job, I'll never see the hundreds of dollars that this person owes me. And so now they feel stuck because they don't owe any money, but they're owed money. And then that is a really common process, because it doesn't cost as much to say, here's your pay this week, here's your pay 2 weeks late. It's very tricky.
It's very duplicitous in many ways.
It really is.
So many of these illegal activities are.
It comes down to the almighty dollar.
Back to legislation, Senator Emmons has done great work in Michigan, apparently, to do a number of things to arrest this progress of human trafficking in Michigan. Are there other states that are moving in this direction that you're aware of? Where is there great progress being made? What does it take?
Yeah, well, it takes a strong legislation. That's what it takes. So all of the 50 states are actually moving in a good direction. If you look at Polaris Project, there's a couple of different organizations that kind of rate the states.
Polaris, P-O-L-A-R-I-S.
Yes.
Polaris.
And you can go find them, polarisproject.org. So they rate all of the states' laws on human trafficking. And they have a 4-tier system. And just this past year, they have a 2014 report out. All of the states are now above a tier 4. So no one is in a tier 4 anymore. North Dakota and South Dakota are the only two who remain at a tier 3. So they have the least amount of legislation against trafficking, and they have the least, if any, and to be in a tier 3, they don't have any significant civil process for victims to be restitution, money for services for mental health, for medical problems, and all of that. There's about 9 or 10 states who are in their tier 2, which means they've made some significant process. There's a few things that are legislated for services and that kind of thing, but they still have a long way to go. Michigan is actually in their tier 2. And then the rest of them are in a tier 1 where they've made broad sweeping changes. Their laws are in complete alignment with the federal laws. So what that does is it allows state prosecutors to take the case rather than having to depend on federal legislators or federal prosecutors to take a case. And sometimes they won't take it if it doesn't cross, you know, a state line or it doesn't have interstate business and commerce and stuff. But now state prosecutors can take these cases and get comparable sentencing. In Missouri, we have the law states that a victim can sue in a civil court their trafficker for their lost wages. The best laws about that make it automatic. So in some states like Washington, I believe, you might want to check me on that, but so the state of Washington, that back wages is calculated and automatic. It's an automatic thing that the trafficker then owes all of that money. On top of their sentencing, they owe the court fees and all of that, but they also automatically owe back wages to these individuals.
That's certainly wonderful for the victim, but it doesn't seem like it's adequate compensation.
No,
for
for what
sure.
they endure, it really isn't.
And I'll ask you just a couple of more things. As we're getting close to our end of this discussion, but there are two things that are really important, I think, that you could shed some light on. One is in reference to your research in Missouri, where you were mapping the risk factors associated with this matter of human trafficking. I mean, there's very little done in geography about this. It might be the only case in geography where risk factors are essentially mapped at a scale like that. Would you comment on what your findings were?
Well, what we found was that we did two separate maps. We did a sex trafficking map and a labor trafficking map, because some of the risks are a little bit different. There are very specific demographic issues when we talk about sex trafficking that aren't in the labor trafficking risk. So we did two maps, and the sex trafficking was kind of as we assumed it would be. There was far more risk in the cities, in the locations where there was military installations, so a concentration of the male population increases the likelihood that there's going to be sex trafficking. And that was very apparent on the map, and it wasn't too surprising. The labor trafficking map is what surprised the most people, because what they had assumed was that labor trafficking was also an urban problem. So that's where all the jobs are, so that must be where all the trafficking is. And according to the labor trafficking map, the risk is a little more evenly distributed over the entire state. And so even a rural place like southeast Missouri, where it's nothing but, you know, farming, has a significant risk of labor trafficking. That
would be an excellent study to emulate in Michigan or other states, especially since you found that this matter of labor trafficking is spread far and wide. Maybe it's in a Chinese restaurant in a small town somewhere where we know there happen to be many trafficked victims, or also those employed in agricultural labor.
Exactly. And so I have started doing that same research in St. Louis. We're doing 4 counties, because we're actually going to cross over into Illinois a little bit, since traffickers and most of us really we're not hindered by a state border. So a lot of that stuff is going to be crossing in and out all the time. So rather than have this fake border of a state, we're going to actually bleed into southwest Missouri a little bit, southwest Illinois. And we're going to do a much smaller scale so we can really dig into these risk factors and see what's happening in these 3 counties, and whether that still holds true, what we found at the state level. Does that still hold true at these 3 counties?
It's a remarkable example of how you could advance some contribution to really the geography of crime in a lot of ways by incorporating your notions of social justice and addressing this matter of human trafficking, because we know that there are ancillary criminal elements associated with this trafficking of people, whether it's for sex work or whether it's for labor. So as we look at sex work now, this is what this is the second point I'd like to discuss is, did you differentiate between prostitution and sex work in general?
It depends on who you're talking to. So there are a lot of social justice workers who do not differentiate. And there's good reason for that. Most individuals, even if they tell you they chose to do it, they chose to do it because they didn't have any other option. And is that really a choice? If you're a single mother and you don't have any skills and you don't have the money to pay for daycare while you work a day job, what are you going to do? Many of them turn to a life of prostitution. So at one level, yeah, it was a choice, but on another level, we didn't give them any other options as a society. And so those individuals say, no, that is not a choice. That's still sex trafficking because we didn't give them options. There are other individuals who see choice as more of a continuum. And so there are some people who make a choice based on too few choices, but they still had agency. They still were taking their life into their own hands and saying, look, this is what I've got. These are my tools. This is what I'm going to do. And then there are other individuals way at the other end, and this might be a small elite group, but they enjoy their work, but they're in charge of it. They set up their own business. They say how many customers they're going to see a day. They set the prices. And so these... they're
a very exclusive element of this club that most people don't want to belong to.
And many of these women who work in that end of the industry join something like the Desiree Alliance, which works towards the more and better legislation to legalization possibly. But when they will tell you very clearly, we made this choice, we like this life, it's the best job for us. So it depends on who you talk to.
Given that, you know, Nick Kristof and Cheryl Wooden have discussed the legalize and regulate model and have argued that it is not a good option, that perhaps the best option is to embrace the practices that it was rooted in Scandinavia, and that is to essentially penalize the customer of the sex act.
Yeah, one of the things that got touted for legalization is it was going to greatly decrease trafficking because it would bring prostitution out of the shadows, and then so women would be more likely to help police the sex industry, and that didn't happen. Legalization might do some really great things like the health of women, getting the government out of women's bodies, like you don't get to decide what I do with my body kind of idea, treating us like adults rather than children, stop the spread of disease because now they have a force behind saying, no, you have to wear a condom. All of these things are really great options for legalization, but it doesn't really do anything to stop trafficking. Trafficking runs right alongside the legal market. What a lot of places are finding that the women won't register their business, so they're still operating illegally because they don't want to pay taxes, so they don't get a license and they operate outside of the law anyway.
So it facilitates an illicit enterprise that generates lower cost for the client and lower revenue, more exploitation.
Yes, and the other thing that it does is those countries that haven't had legalization for a lengthy time, they've done it within the last 5-6 years, demand has skyrocketed. Well, no matter how great you think the sex industry might be, there aren't enough women to supply the demand who want to do this work free will. So where's that supply going to come from? It's going to be forced. So that has not done nothing. So in that way, Nicholas Kristof and Cheryl Wooden are right. It doesn't do anything for trafficking.
Lastly, we have only a minute to go, and I'd like to ask you to ponder for a moment what recommendations you might have for law enforcement officials, for public citizens, for legislators in terms of arresting this problem?
I think it behooves us to find the red flags, learn what it looks like in reality, and don't take your cue from Hollywood and Taken and all of that. But learn the reality of it. What does it look like on the ground? Learn the hotline, 888-3737-888. All the right numerical digits required, just rearrange so that it's easy memorization. And leave tips when you think something's not right. It's easy, they're well trained, they know what to do from there. I think officers and legislators need to have a profound shift in mindset so that when an officer goes out on the street and they are arresting a woman for prostitution because it is illegal in that state, treat her with respect and understand that she's probably more of a victim than a criminal. And if you can do that, you will go a long way in helping her help you catch who's really behind the work and the pimps and the traffickers. But if you continue to treat her with disrespect and continue to treat her like a criminal and continue to not care about her life, she's not going to ever trust you. She's not ever going to break her loyalty to her pimp, and her and other women and young men will continue to be exploited. And legislators need to find a backbone. They just really need to understand that social justice is something that needs to be legislated and not left up to the goodwill of humanity, because I think we've proven throughout our history that if left to ourselves, we don't do a very good job of being kind to each other.
Amanda, thank you so very much. You have certainly developed strong leadership in this area in Missouri, and we look forward to hearing more about you and what you're doing to arrest this problem of human trafficking. It's an honor to have you here, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Honored to be here.
Okay.